everybody agrees we need more money and we need more spending. But if you spend more than you earn, you have to borrow. Mm-hmm. And that creates debt. At first, it's credit, so it gives you buying power. But you have to pay it back, and that becomes depressing. And so in order to avoid that, central banks can print money and buy it back. But when they do that, that depreciates the value of money. So what we had was a lot of money and credit go out to a lot of people, a lot of buying power. Everybody, when they got it, they thought, oh, that's great. And somehow seemed surprised that when we spend it, the prices of everything go up. But the truth is that if you divide the amount of money and credit that's used for spending by the quantity of goods produced, you can calculate, well, the prices will change. And so that's what's going on. And that's what went on in a giant wave, the Federal Reserve and the government together. And that produced a giant amount of inflation, between 7.5% if you use year over year, or if you take the core inflation rate, it's closer to 12 and it's rising. There's some temporary influence. Buying power is what matters, right? So what happens is when inflation goes up faster than your other sources of income, you lose buying power. But somehow that seems more acceptable sometimes to people than if it was just taken out of your pocket. You see, if, let's say, raise taxes or take it out of somebody's pocket, everybody complains, whoever's had the pocket taken out of. But if it comes through printing of money and everybody gets checks, it's more acceptable. But those who are holding money, like money market funds and bond funds, lose the buying power of that. So think about those bond funds. Those bond funds are like down about 10%, and inflation is up over, let's call it 8%. So they lost 18% of the buying power. We think of it as meaning higher prices, but to some extent, that's a rich man's perspective, because say, well, now I have to pay more. But the reality is you don't get more stuff from that higher inflation. And so we're seeing a time now where you're going to lose buying power to inflation. And now you're going to see the Federal Reserve also tighten money and credit and raise interest rates. And when they do that, that creates less buying power. You know, say, okay, now you can't spend as much money and the prices are going high, but they do that in their crude way of trying to reduce inflation. But you get it from both ends, the higher prices and then the higher interest rates you have to pay and the higher service costs, and also less availability of money. So it's a squeeze, like the squeeze that happened in the 1970s. These things go in paradigm shifts that quite often take, relatively long time, because everybody's mindset is in a certain place and they're doing certain things. There are two monoliths and they're at war with each other. And we have populism, which is you have to get on one side or the other. So when the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. The risk of neither party accepting losing the elections is significant. The idea of democracy is compromise, reaching across, that the law and the rule is of a higher purpose than anything else. But when you get other things that are more important to people, that they're willing to fight for, then you get greater and greater, and it's self-reinforcing, because moderates are people who want to work across party lines and so on, and compromise are through history, through the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, or these are civil wars. In all of those cases, the moderates, they're hurt or they're disposed of, and you have to pick a side. But you're seeing this now. The ideologies are dominant. So for example, when Elon Musk buys Twitter, the decisions he will make regarding Twitter will probably have a greater effect on our society than the decisions the Supreme Court makes. It's one of the symptoms that it's not normal economics in the usual way. So it's a different game that people should be aware of. If I was president of the United States, I would have a bipartisan cabinet to try to bring moderates from both sides. I'd have an economic program that was put together like a Manhattan Project, in which smart people from both sides would make changes. I have my own changes that could happen, in which it would both increase the size of the pie and divide it well. Move much more toward equal opportunity, in which people are productive. I'll describe the cycle. By an order, I mean like a world order or domestic order, the system that's in place run by the people who have the power and then determine what the system is like. So you change orders, usually by wars, because you have a conflict and then, okay, how do you resolve the conflict? You have a war. So World War II ended in 1945. The United States won World War II dominantly. It became the richest country in the world, having 80% of the world's money. Money was gold then. It had 80% of the world's gold. And a dominant military. It had a monopoly on that, and it accounted for half the world's economy. It's the reason why the United Nations is in New York and the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, D.C. It was the American world order because it was dominant power. It's not like some are rich and some are poor in the same way. There's a restructuring and you don't have the same wealth gaps and resentments and so on. And that usually means that you have a period of peace and prosperity. Peace because nobody wants to fight the dominant power. And then work together and produce peace and prosperity, and that happens. And that's really does best in the capitalist system, in which capital is provided to those who have good ideas because they say, we'll invest in you and you'll be productive and so on. But what capitalism does at the same time is it creates large wealth gaps, and it also creates higher levels of indebtedness. So it creates the large wealth gaps because it distributes that unequally. And then that can be self-perpetuating because those who get power, like if you have more money, you can educate your children better. Gradually, you lose equal opportunity and you produce wealth gap and you produce resentments. And you also then create larger amounts of debt quite often. That means that that's a problem down the road. Now, what happens when you become the world's largest power, this is also always the case. It happened with the Dutch, it happened with the British, that because you're so powerful on production, you go all around the world and you are the largest trading country in the world. You get more exports than other countries and more transactions are in your currency. And so everybody uses your currency, which becomes the world's reserve currency. And because it's the world's currency, different countries save in it, which means that lend to you in it. And that increases your debt to foreigners because when they hold a bond or they hold cash in that, they're lending it to you to get the dollars back in the future. So there's that. And then there's also a change in generations and generation psychology. The greatest generation, in a sense, are those who fought through the war, appreciate basic things, that kind of a thing. And then what happens is when you're on top, you become more expensive and quite often more decadent. I mean, you might spend on things that are not good investments and don't last very long or whatever, for entertainment at the sake of buying. So for example, in the United States, I remember when we had a per capita income, which was 40 times China's, and we started borrowing from China. So these are the ingredients. And then you start to see that they cause problems, the financial problem, the internal conflict problem, and so on. And then the type of fighting that we're talking about. It's so interesting because in the mid 1600s, this is interesting. There was 30 years of war, call it the 30 Years' War in Europe, and just beating the daylights out of each other. And that is when invented countries as we know it. Before then, there were no boundaries. And what mattered was power. And if you wanted something that the other guy had, you'd go get it and he'd do the same with you. And there was this constant fighting about things. And then in the 1600s, they were fighting about religion too. There's the religious Reformation and the others, which also had to do with power because the church was powerful. But anyway, so invented countries as we know it with boundaries, and you determine what goes on in your borders and so on. And of course, for the next 100 years, there were hardly any wars. But when the time comes, there's no universal legal system. There's no universal policeman. So if you don't have a universal legal system, there have been attempts at that with the United Nations or before that, the League of Nations, they attempted that, but power rules. And so you're going to have tests of power. It'll come down to tests of power. I want everything that I do to not be opinionated. A very big leading indicator is the relative level of education. And those that have more educated population, and you could see the numbers rise, you could see education levels in one country or another rise or decline in these charts. So you could see how is the United States in its education and how are other countries, and is that gap improving or worsening? Because education levels are very indicative of well-being and economic behavior. Rule of law. Countries that have rule of law and respect for the law that keeps order and effectively. When crime rates go up, it's a problem. A very good indicator is corruption levels. There's a corruption index that all countries have. You can see how it changes. And as it goes up, there's a negative 52% correlation with the growth of a country and its corruption over the next 10 years. The USA is reasonably good on the corruption element. Russia is bad. You know, it's interesting because these are predictors of the future. And what you find out is, like, if you look at Russia, I'll give that as an example, it's blessed with the greatest natural resources of any country in the world. The value of its natural resources are 40% higher than the next highest country, which is the United States. And it does a pretty good job of having an educated population. It's not heavily indebted and so on, but it's cultural issues in terms of these things like corruption. Also, there are measures of bureaucracy versus efficiency. Lots of measures of attitude. Can I start a business and make my dreams happen? You can see the differences between countries on just that attitude, okay? And also you could see it in the bureaucracy. How long does it take to set up a business? There are statistics like that. If there was education and experience from the age of 5 to 15, that would change everything. We learn differently. Scientists have shown prior to puberty, we learn in an internal way. And you'll find that a number of people had their passion at around age 12, because that has to do with how the brain changes. But if you take that 5 to 15 and you incorporate it in the education system and the practice of saving, spending, and so on, you don't need a PhD in this thing. The money thing is kind of very basic, you know. If I can buy it for less than I sell it, that's a good thing. The more volume I could do, the better it is. Then there are fixed costs and there are variable costs. So if I'm going to build a stand, a lemonade stand, okay, what's that going to cost me? Okay, that's a capital expenditure. It's all the same stuff that you could learn, you know, at those ages, and you don't. I spent a lot of time in China starting in 1984. Not to earn money because I didn't have any money, but because I was very curious. And then I got to know and like the people, and I was able to help them develop their stock markets and things. And so I watched. Since 1984, when I first started, per capita income has increased by 26 times. The poverty rate, measured by hunger, went from 88% to less than 1%. And life expectancy increased an average of 10 years. Hunger was 88%, that type of poverty. And so what has happened is we have become a roughly comparable power of the United States, in some ways a bit ahead, in some ways a bit behind, and so on. And that's in most things. If you talk about military, is it in that region? Is it of that type? Or is it another type or something? But it's comparable. If you talk about technology, when I first went to China, I would give $10 calculators to people, and they thought they were miracle devices. Now, if you take it in artificial intelligence and most technologies, there depends on the one. There may be ahead in some and not. So what that means is that they've come up to be a leading competitive power. There's no other competitive power like that.